Japan is the fourth largest economy on Earth. It builds the world's most advanced robots, ships some of the most reliable cars on the planet, and sits at the center of global technology and trade. And yet, right now, along its coastline, it faces three nuclear-armed neighbors: Russia to the north, North Korea just across the sea, and China, whose navy is now the largest in the world by number of ships. You'd expect a country like that to have a serious military, and in a lot of ways, it does. But here's the strange part. Officially, on paper, Japan is not allowed to have a military. Not a small one, not a weak one. None. Zero. By law, Japan cannot maintain an army, a navy, or an air force for the purpose of waging war. This isn't because Japan can't afford one. Japan spends over $50 billion a year on defense. That number is higher than most countries in NATO. It has fighter jets. It has destroyers. It has hundreds of thousands of trained personnel in uniform. So how does a country spend that kind of money, train that many people, and build that kind of hardware, while legally insisting it has no army at all? The answer goes back to a single sentence, written not by Japan, but by American officials in 1946. That one sentence has shaped Japan's entire military identity for almost 80 years. It's one of the strangest legal loopholes in modern history, and it's still causing arguments inside Japan's government right now in 2026. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Japan has around 250,000 armed personnel, tanks, fighter jets, submarines, and warships, and still, officially, calls none of it an army. Let's go back to where this actually started. To understand this, you have to go back to August 1945. Japan had just lost the deadliest war in its history. Two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been destroyed by atomic bombs, while Tokyo itself had been firebombed into rubble. Historians estimate that around 3 million Japanese people died over the course of the war. For the first time in its 2,000-year history, Japan was occupied by a foreign power. From 1945 to 1952, American General Douglas MacArthur effectively ran the country as the head of the Allied occupation. MacArthur's team had one major fear: the same Japanese military that had attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded much of Asia could, if left alone, eventually rebuild and start another war. They weren't willing to take that risk. So in 1946, American officials drafted a brand new constitution for Japan. Not just influenced it, they wrote the first working draft themselves, in English, in about a week, then handed it over to Japanese officials to translate and formally adopt. Buried inside that document was a clause that would become known as Article 9. It states that Japan renounces war as a way of settling international disputes, and that it will never maintain an army, a navy, or an air force. Not a smaller one. Not a purely defensive one. The original wording says, never. Japanese lawmakers at the time had almost no leverage to push back. The country was occupied, its cities were in ruins, and people were struggling just to find food. So they signed it. Nobody sitting in that room in 1946 expected one clause, written by a foreign power in a matter of days, to still be shaping Japan's military policy 8 decades later. But that's exactly what happened, and the way Japan worked around it is even stranger than the clause itself. Here's where it gets strange. Just 4 years after that constitution was signed, Japan built an army anyway. In 1950, the Korean War broke out right next door on the Korean Peninsula. Suddenly, the United States needed Japan to help stabilize the region, and a country with zero armed forces became a serious problem for American strategy in Asia. So the US quietly encouraged Japan to start rearming, and Japan found a workaround. They wouldn't call it a military. They'd call it something else entirely. In 1954, Japan formally created the Self-Defense Forces, SDF. On paper, it isn't classified as an army, but as an organization dedicated purely to self-defense. In practice, however, it operates fighter jets, submarines, destroyers, and one of the most technologically advanced navies in the entire Pacific region. In other words, Japan built a fully modern military, and then built an entire legal argument to explain why it technically isn't one. But there's a catch. Because the SDF is legally restricted to defending Japan itself, it can't take offensive action far from its own shores. That limitation meant Japan still needed real protection if a larger war ever broke out. That's where the second half of the arrangement comes in, the US-Japan Security Treaty. In exchange for hosting more than 50,000 American troops on Japanese soil, including major bases in Okinawa and Yokosuka, the United States formally commits to defending Japan if it's ever attacked. So here's the real answer to how this actually works. Japan doesn't need a full military of its own, because America's military effectively functions as Japan's military instead. For about 70 years, this arrangement has mostly held together quietly in the background. But recently, that balance has started to shift. And the reason is unfolding right now in the region surrounding Japan. Fast forward to today, and that 1946 arrangement is under more pressure than it's faced in decades. China now operates the world's largest navy by number of ships. North Korea test-fires missiles over Japanese territory on a near-annual basis. And tensions surrounding Taiwan sit less than 70 miles from Japan's own islands. In 2022, Japan made its biggest defense policy shift in generations. It announced plans to roughly double its defense spending, and for the first time since World War II, declared it would acquire what's called counter-strike capability, the ability to strike an enemy missile base before an attack ever reaches Japan. That single decision pushed right up against the edge of what Article 9 was originally written to prevent. As a result, there's now a real, active political movement inside Japan to formally revise or even remove Article 9 altogether, a conversation that would have seemed almost unthinkable just 2 decades ago. Public opinion inside Japan is genuinely divided. Older generations, who still remember the devastation of the war firsthand, tend to be the strongest defenders of the peace clause exactly as it was written. Younger generations, who grew up watching missile tests and rising regional tensions, are increasingly open to change. So here's the real question. This leaves us with: Article 9 was written by a foreign country 80 years ago, specifically to ensure Japan could never fight another war. Today, in a region that's more tense than it's been in decades, is that same clause still protecting Japan? Or is it beginning to put Japan at greater risk? That exact debate is unfolding inside Tokyo today, and however it's ultimately resolved, it could reshape the balance of power across Asia for the rest of this century.